Have you ever stopped to wonder what life was like in a world without refrigerators, freezers, or even the simple luxury of a pantry filled with canned goods? Picture it, a time when there was no quick dash to the store for milk, no late night rate of leftovers, no option to order food when hunger struck. In medieval Europe, survival depended on ingenuity, tradition, and often sheer stubbornness against the elements. And nowhere was this struggle more visible than in the kitchen. Forget the modern image of a sleek, stainless steel sanctuary. A medieval kitchen was smoky, noisy, and alive. The hearth dominated the room, blazing constantly, filling the air with the scent of roasting meat and the sting of wood smoke. Herbs dangled from beams, meats hung drying in the rafters, and the air carried an orchestra of smells, some comforting, others overwhelming. These kitchens weren't just rooms for cooking. They were laboratories of survival, the beating heart of households where people fought daily battles against rot, pests, and the unforgiving march of time. When winter came, and in medieval times, winter was not merely a season, but a threat. Families relied entirely on the food they had preserved. Spring and summer were periods of frantic preparation, when surplus food was transformed into something capable of enduring the icy months. Failure to prepare wasn't just inconvenient. It could mean famine. Imagine entire villages tied to the rhythm of preservation, salting, smoking, drying, fermenting rituals repeated generation after generation. Their knowledge passed down like sacred inheritance. It's strange to think how alien their world would feel to us. Try explaining ketchup to a medieval cook, or the idea of frozen pizza. They would likely laugh or stare in confusion. Instead, their must-haves were salt, wood smoke, snow, vinegar, honey, and beer. Each element a tool in their fight against spoilage, each with its own fascinating story. And so, the history of medieval food is not only about what they ate, but how they managed to eat it all. It is a story of creativity, desperation, and sometimes astonishing brilliance. Let's begin where all preservation began, with salt. Because if you think of salt today as a simple seasoning, you might be surprised to discover that for much of history, salt was closer to gold. To us, salt is ordinary, sprinkled without thought over fries, stocked cheaply in every supermarket. But to the people of the Middle Ages, salt was treasure. It was not simply a seasoning. It was survival itself. Entire economies, wars, and fortunes were built upon its crystals. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid with salt. And even centuries later, in medieval Europe, salt remained a substance so valuable that it was often locked away like coin or silverware. Merchants in Venice and Genoa built vast empires on the salt trade, their fleets carrying shimmering cargoes that determined who thrived and who starved. These men were the tech billionaires of their time, but instead of trading in data or devices, they dealt in something as basic as flavor. For a peasant, a single pound of salt could cost an entire week's wages. For villages cut off from trade, lacking salt could spell disaster. There are records of French peasants trading entire flocks of sheep for just enough to last through one winter. Salt was so indispensable because it performed one miraculous task. It stopped food from rotting. The method was deceptively simple. Meat or fish was rubbed, packed, and drowned in heavy layers of salt, sometimes up to 20% of its weight. The result was unrecognizable. The meat shriveled, stiff, its juices drawn out, until it resembled little more than a husk. But within that withered form lay survival, transformed into a medieval version of jerky. One 13th century recipe instructed cooks to cover the flesh as though with snow. It was a poetic description, yet it carried the weight of life and death. Without such preservation, there would be no food for soldiers marching to war, no nourishment for families huddled through long northern winters, no stores to carry monasteries and villages through the lean seasons. But the power of salt stretched beyond kitchens. Medieval doctors believed it purified the body, even prescribed salted remedies for ailments, though today we know too much salt can kill rather than cure. And yet, the belief reveals just how deeply salt had woven itself into every aspect of medieval thought. Of course, salt's magic came at a steep price. For kings and nobles, the cost was manageable, but for the poor, it was crippling. And so, in the smoky rafters of peasant homes and in the sprawling estates of the nobility, a new technique rose alongside salting, a process as fragrant as it was practical: smoking. Imagine stepping into a medieval kitchen. Forget gleaming tiles and shining steel counters. Instead, you'd be met with a haze of smoke so thick your eyes might water instantly. The air was dense, carrying the smell of burning oak, applewood, and cherry, mingled with the rich scent of meat slowly transforming above the flames. In those days, the kitchen was not only where meals were cooked, it was the smokehouse itself. Smoking was both necessity and art. Where salt was precious, smoke was free, drawn from the same fire that warmed the hearth and cooked the family's bread. Meat, fish, and even cheese were hung high in rafters or near chimneys, where plumes of smoke curled upward, blanketing them in an invisible armor against decay. For peasants, this meant their hard-earned food wouldn't spoil. For nobles, it added a prized flavor, a subtle distinction of wealth, even in preservation. The process was ingenious. Different woods were carefully chosen, each with its own flavor. Oak lent a deep, robust character, perfect for beef. Apple gave a sweetness to pork. Cherry left poultry with a lighter, almost fruity taste. A German cookbook from the Middle Ages even listed wood types like ingredients, as though the fire itself were part of the recipe. This attention to detail reveals how deeply ingrained smoking had become in culinary culture, not simply a way to survive, but a way to savor. There were entire structures dedicated to smoking, separate smokehouses built by wealthy estates with multiple levels designed for specific meats. The top level was reserved for delicate foods like fish, which needed a gentler smoke. The middle tier held pork, requiring a balance of flavor and preservation. And the lowest racks, closest to the fire, bore beef, where heavy smoke cured the thick cuts most effectively. It was the medieval version of a 3-story parking garage, but instead of wagons and horses, it held dangling, fragrant food. Even archaeology bears witness to the endurance of this method. In London, remains of a smokehouse from 1375 were discovered. And remarkably, the ceiling beams still carried the smell of smoke after more than 6 centuries. Imagine that smoke itself, trapped in wood across generations, whispering to us of the fires that once burned day and night. And smoke did more than preserve, it flavored life itself. Clothing, hair, even skin absorbed its scent. To live in a medieval household was to carry the perfume of smoke everywhere, perhaps to the church pews, to the market stalls, to the feasts of nobles. It was survival's signature, the scent of endurance. And though it may seem odd to us today, in those days, smelling of smoked bacon was far preferable to the other alternatives in a world without modern hygiene. Yet even smoke could not preserve everything forever. As winters dragged on and meat stores dwindled, peasants and lords alike turned to another ally, the earth itself, with its cold, secret chambers of stone and ice. If smoke was the breath of preservation, then cold was its silence. Long before refrigeration, medieval people turned to nature's freezer ice, snow, and the steady chill of stone cellars buried deep underground. In winter, when frost blanketed fields and rivers froze hard enough for children to skate, peasants and servants worked tirelessly to gather snow and ice. It wasn't play, it was survival. These blocks of frozen water were hoarded like treasure, hauled into pits or caves, then packed tightly with straw or sawdust. Insulation as effective in the Middle Ages as it is today. What the peasants preserved in barns and caves, the wealthy preserved in architectural marvels. House made of ice. Ice houses were the medieval world's underground vaults, conical, stone-lined pits, often resembling an inverted beehive hidden beneath the earth. The most famous at Hampton Court Palace could hold 75 tons of ice. That's not just enough to chill a feast for kings. It was enough to keep noble households in cool storage through entire summers. Wealthy lords even employed specialists called ice masters, whose sole duty was to protect this fragile luxury from heat. Imagine having a job title built entirely around keeping water frozen. These ice houses worked astonishingly well. By layering sawdust between each block of ice, they created insulation so efficient that some vaults preserved ice for nearly 2 years. In an age when the sun dictated survival, this was nothing short of magic. But cold wasn't only for kings. Nature gave its own steady chill. In rural villages, people relied on caves and stone cellars, where temperatures stayed around 50 degrees year-round. Within these dark earthen rooms, cheese hardened, vegetables kept their bite, and beer or wine cooled in quiet casks. Monks, ever practical, carved artificial caves solely to protect their sacred brews. For them, preservation wasn't just necessity, it was devotion. Sometimes, preservation meant spectacle. At noble feasts, servants packed fish and fruit in snow, rushing it from mountain passes or icy rivers to the banquet tables. These became medieval party tricks: snow-cooled wine, frozen sorbets flavored with honey, even rudimentary ice creams. Guests marveled at snow cones centuries before the invention of the modern freezer. And like today, jokes endured. "Do not eat the yellow snow" was as funny then as it is now. But winter, as it always does, faded. The snow melted, ice houses grew thin, and the cellars emptied. Then, preservation demanded a new form: the sun. Itself, its heat turned from enemy to ally. Food was hung, spread, dried, and thinned until it transformed again into something light, hard, and enduring. The next stage in the great struggle against spoilage had begun: drying. When the ice melted and cellars emptied, the people of the Middle Ages turned to the most ancient of all preservation methods: drying. It was as old as civilization itself, yet in medieval Europe, the craft reached new levels of ingenuity. Drying was about transformation. Meat was sliced into thin strips until it resembled parchment, then strung from beams where smoke and sun worked together. Grapes shriveled into raisins, plums into prunes, apples into leathery curls of sweetness. A cottage kitchen might resemble a festive hall, year-round rafters strung with ropes of fruit and herbs like garlands for a never-ending feast. To a stranger stepping inside, it may have looked decorative, almost joyful. In truth, it was insurance against hunger. But this wasn't haphazard. Some regions built entire structures dedicated to drying, towering frameworks with open slats to let air circulate while shielding food from birds. In France, these were nicknamed fruit castles, wooden fortresses filled with apples, pears, and figs. One famous tower could hold over 2,000 pounds of fruit, more than many villages could harvest in a season. Archaeologists have even discovered remnants of dried fruit, clinging stubbornly to ancient beams after 5 centuries. Tiny echoes of survival. Drying was tailored to the food. Herbs were bundled and hung upside down, their oils preserved more potently than if left to wilt. Fish, often flattened with hammers until paper thin, could harden so completely that sailors joked you could roof a house with them. In fact, some Norse sagas mention warriors gnawing on dried cod as if it were wood, their jaws straining against its density. Meat, cut thin, was prized for portability. A single cow, dried properly, could shrink into a bundle the size of a man's packlight. Enough for an army on the march. This portability made dried food the lifeblood of war. Medieval armies carried sacks of jerky and dried fish, overseen by a special officer, the keeper of the dry stores. His was not a glamorous title, yet without him, soldiers starved. Marches across Europe, crusades into the Holy Land, all relied on the ability to carry provisions that would not rot under the merciless sun. But drying had its risks. Food left too long in damp air could mold, while cuts too thick might rot from within. Cooks learned to test by touch and sound. A strip of beef that bent softly was dangerous. One that snapped like wood was safe. If it shatters, you've made a weapon, quipped one 14th century text. It wasn't a joke. Improperly dried meat was worse than useless. It was a silent poison. And yet, when done right, dried foods became almost eternal. They were wealth condensed, nourishment preserved, and in many cases, delicacies in their own right. To chew on a raisin in midwinter was to taste the memory of summer. To break bread studded with dried figs was to defy the passing of time. There were foods too delicate, too temperamental, to rely on the sun and air. For these, medieval ingenuity found another answer, one sharp, sour, and enduring. When drying failed, the people of Europe reached for vinegar, and with it, the strange alchemy of fermentation. When the sun could no longer be trusted and damp weather spoiled the drying racks, medieval households turned to a different force altogether: controlled rot. To us, the word may sound unappetizing, but to them, it was salvation. Vinegar and fermentation became the silent guardians of survival. Walk into a medieval kitchen, and you would find barrels everywhere, some foaming, others reeking, many sealed tight to trap their pungent magic. Cabbages slowly softened into sauerkraut, cucumbers transformed into pickles, and even fish, once sharp and briny, mellowed into something edible, if not delightful. One medieval German recipe bluntly instructed: leave the fish in vinegar until it ceases to smell of fish and begins to smell of something else. That something else was often regret, but it kept starvation at bay. The brilliance of fermentation was hidden in its invisible army: bacteria. Without knowing the science, people discovered that good bacteria could fight off the bad. A barrel of sauerkraut didn't just fill bellies, it gave vital vitamins in the dead of winter. Historians now believe that pickled foods may have prevented scurvy in Europe centuries before sailors carried citrus on ships. In this way, a humble cabbage packed in brine became a shield against disease. Monasteries refined the practice. Within stone cloisters, monks carefully recorded pickling experiments in neat Latin script. One French abbey, records show, preserved over 15,000 eggs in vinegar in a single year. Imagine the poor brother tasked with turning them, checking the brine, his hands permanently perfumed with sourness. Some monks even wrote verses about their craft sermons to vinegar, poetry to turnips submerged in brine. Elsewhere, whole cultures made fermentation into an identity. The Vikings, those seafaring raiders of the north, had their infamous lutefisk fish, soaked not just in brine but in lye, transforming it into a quivering, jelly-like mass. What others might have considered a crime against food, the Norse praised as a delicacy. A brave man fears many things, an old saying went, but only a fool fears not the lutefisk. To them, fermentation was proof of courage as much as sustenance. Yet, behind the jokes and strange recipes, fermentation was deadly serious. Families counted on those barrels to last the winter. In many cases, pickled vegetables were heirlooms, passed down like treasure. One English castle maintained a single barrel of pickled cabbage for 40 years, topping it up with vinegar year after year, generation after generation. Imagine tasting from the same brine your great-grandfather once relied upon. Doctors, too, embraced fermentation. Remedies were prescribed straight from the kitchen: fermented radish for stomach troubles, vinegar-soaked onions for fevers, cabbage juice for wounds. In some hospitals, records show, patients drank gallons of fermented vegetable juice each month. Whether it healed or merely distracted them is debatable. But the faith in pickles was unshakable. Pickling was not just preservation. It was transformation. It turned the harsh, raw flavors of food into something sour, sharp, and enduring. A humble barrel of vinegar became, in its way, as valuable as salt. It could stretch a harvest, protect a family, and carry life through months of darkness. But for those who could afford sweetness, for those who wanted not only survival but luxury, there was another path, one golden, sticky, and eternal. When vinegar's bite grew tiresome, the people of the Middle Ages turned to honey, the nectar that never spoiled. If vinegar was sharp and sour, honey was its golden opposite, sweet, soothing, and nearly immortal. For peasants, it was rare. For nobles and monasteries, it was sacred. And for all who could obtain it, honey was not just food, it was preservation. Incarnate, unlike meat or fruit, honey does not spoil. Archaeologists have uncovered sealed jars of honey in Egyptian tombs, over 3,000 years old, still glistening and edible. The medieval world knew this well. In an age when rot lurked in every corner, honey was the miracle that stood defiant against time itself. In kitchens, it was both preservative and ingredient. Fruits were boiled gently in honey until they candied into chewy jewels. Nuts were suspended in golden syrup, meat glazed and sealed beneath sticky layers. This was preservation through sweetness, turning food not just safe but decadent. For peasants, a spoonful of honey might appear only on feast days. For kings, entire banquets dripped with honey-roasted hams, honey cakes, and fruits so candied they seemed sculpted from amber. But honey was more than taste, it was medicine. Physicians prescribed it for coughs, wounds, and even as an antidote to poisons. A bandage smeared with honey became a barrier against infection. A tonic of honey and vinegar, known as oxymel, was a common cure-all. In monasteries, jars of honey sat beside prayer books, both believed to protect body and soul. Beekeeping was its own holy labor. Monks kept elaborate apiaries, tending hives as carefully as altars. They sang hymns to bees, calling them God's tiny servants. One medieval text declared, "Bees are models of a holy life, for they labor not for themselves but for all." Their honey preserved more than food, it preserved faith, culture, and community. For nobles, honey was wealth. A well-stocked larder of candied fruits and honeyed wines announced not just prosperity but sophistication. Diplomats carried honeyed confections as gifts, sweet offerings to soften even the hardest negotiations. In the north, mead, the fermented drink of honey, flowed like liquid gold, fueling both festivals and legends. Warriors toasted with it, poets sang of it, and kings demanded it as tribute. And yet, even honey had limits. It was precious, scarce, and for most peasants, unattainable beyond rare moments. To preserve daily food, families relied instead on methods both humble and vast, methods of storage, of architecture itself. For in the end, preservation was not only about salt, smoke, or sweetness. It was about where you kept your food and how you built your defenses against rot. The next chapter in this struggle would not take place in barrels or hives, but in cellars, pantries, and castles designed as fortresses not only for men, but for bread and meat alike. If food could be salted, smoked, dried, or steeped in honey, the battle was only half won. The final victory against decay lay not in spices or sweetness, but in walls of stone, beams of oak, and the cool earth beneath one's feet. Medieval people did not only preserve food, they built entire spaces, dedicated to keeping it alive through seasons of hunger. Every great manor, monastery, and castle had its own hidden underworld, the cellar. These were not mere storage rooms. They were cathedrals of preservation, dug deep beneath the earth where the temperature stayed steady, cool in summer and frostbitten in winter. There, barrels of ale lined the walls, wheels of cheese ripened slowly, and sacks of grain waited like buried treasure. To enter a noble's cellar was to step into the fortress. Within the fortress, the quiet heart that sustained the entire household. For peasants, cellars were humbler but no less vital. Dug beneath cottages, they stored root vegetables and dried goods. Carrots, parsnips, turnips, and onions were layered with straw, resting in the cool darkness until they were needed for winter stews. Families would step carefully into these earthen hollows, lit by a single torch, to retrieve the food that kept them alive through famine and frost. Above ground, the pantry served as a household's nervous system. In castles, the pantry was divided into strict domains, one for bread, one for meat, one for ale, each overseen by officials with titles that seem both mundane and magnificent: panter, butler, cellarer. Their duty was sacred, for to mismanage food was to endanger lives. An ill-kept pantry could mean famine even in times of plenty. Monasteries, with their vows of discipline, turned storage into an art form. Their granaries were built high on stone stilts, safe from rodents and dampness. Ventilation slits kept grain dry, while walls thick as ramparts locked away the harvest from rain and thieves alike. In these granaries, entire winters of bread lay waiting, silent and secure, as monks chanted in the cloisters above. But nowhere was storage more elaborate than in the great castles of Europe. At Dover Castle, vast underground chambers held enough food and ale to withstand sieges lasting months. At the Tower of London, records reveal that barrels of salted beef and dried fish were stacked in careful order, rotated and inspected like soldiers on parade. Even ice houses, those subterranean cones of frozen wealth, were forms of architecture as preservation. Stone and timber joined salt and honey in the eternal war against time. For the wealthy, storage was luxury as much as necessity. Banquets demanded not just food for the day, but exotic preserves waiting months in advance, spiced wines, candied fruits, foreign nuts wrapped in cloth. To serve such delicacies was to display both wealth and foresight, a reminder that the master of the house could command not only armies, but the very seasons. And yet, storage was fragile. Rats gnawed through grain sacks, mold crept up damp walls, and thieves, hungry or desperate, could undo months of careful planning in a single night. Perhaps that is why medieval lords so often spoke of food as treasure, more precious even than gold. Gold could be hoarded, but food gave life. So it was that cellars and pantries became the silent stage of survival. Wars might be won on battlefields, but families endured through the dark of winter because of what lay hidden beneath their homes. In the end, food preservation was not only a matter of taste or science, it was a matter of endurance, a quiet defiance against hunger that shaped the very architecture of the medieval world. And with this, our journey through salt, smoke, snow, vinegar, honey, and stone reaches its end. From the simplest peasant cottage to the grandest royal palace, medieval people proved that human ingenuity could bend even the laws of time. Today, when we open a refrigerator without a thought, we are touching the distant echoes of that long battle, the ingenuity of our ancestors who refused to let food or hope slip away. The story of medieval preservation is not merely about salt barrels or honey jars. It is about human resilience. Each method, salting, smoking, freezing, fermenting, sweetening, storing, was a testament to creativity born from necessity. Hunger was the eternal enemy, yet every winter survived was a quiet victory, won not with swords, but with cellars and brine. For peasants, survival meant turning hardship into habit. For nobles, it meant turning preservation into power. For monks, it was devotion, recorded in ink and prayer. And for all, it was proof that life could endure even the coldest, cruelest nights. Today, as our refrigerators hum softly in markets, overflow with abundance, we stand on the shoulders of those who learned to stretch a cabbage through winter, to coax sweetness from honey, and to turn rot into nourishment. Their struggle whispers through every bite we take, the story of survival, of persistence, of the human will to outlast the dark. The medieval world did not merely survive the coldest nights. It thrived because it learned to preserve.